Yes, it is, and welcome back. Wednesday, December 1st, 2021. Our friend and teacher George Orwell lamented the problems of the English language many a decade ago, writing, quote, "The decline of language must ultimately have political and economic causes. It's not due simply to the bad influence of this or that individual writer, but in effect can become a cause, reinforcing the original cause and producing the same effects in an intensified form, and so on indefinitely. A man may take to drink because he feels himself to be a failure, and then fail all the more completely because of his drinking. It is rather the same thing that is happening to the English language. It becomes ugly and inaccurate because our thoughts are foolish. But the slovenliness of our language makes it easier for us to have foolish thoughts." Close quote. That was George Orwell. And to allow those foolish thoughts to maintain the force of persuasion and then take on a new truth of their own is what we grapple with here. A new truth. Because in our political age, absolutes are out, and truth seems to always require a modifier so that the political animal can use it to his advantage, even when it is otherwise unavailable. Consider, Donald Trump holds a rally perfectly protected by at least two clauses in the First Amendment. In that rally, he gives a speech. He urges his supporters to march peacefully to the Capitol. Some don't. In fact, some never even heard him, having marched on the Capitol unpeaceably while he was still speaking. Donald Trump gets impeached for that and cited by the political class with incitement and massively disrupting our democracy to the point of something so egregious we are told it hasn't taken place since the Civil War, as the current president of the United States continues to put it. You have to change or be ignorant of history and language for any of that to be actually considered true. I note in passing that with all the modifiers we put on truth these days, it is a mark of our decline that we now require the modifier actually to be placed in front of the word truth or true. There have been plenty of attacks on the Capitol, some violent, some not. The Puerto Rican nationalist terrorist attack on the Capitol in some of your lifetimes would be but one of several examples. But we don't speak of that, right? We wipe it off of our history books because, well, you know, wrong politics, wrong nationalities. By the way, 5 U.S. representatives, 5 members of the House of Representatives were shot that day. But only January 6, 2021, where one rioter was shot. Rioter is to be part of the history books. One could argue when protesters disrupted Supreme Court nominee hearings and then created invented victims to further stop the nomination process, that was a disruption or an end run of democracy. One could argue when leftists stormed and took over the Wisconsin state capitol for days to cheers from the Democrats, that was a disruption of democracy, a cessation of the people's right to vote and be representative and enact laws. One could argue when Democrats fled the state of Texas, state legislators, elected legislators in Texas, fled the state so as to avoid a subpoena and quorum in the state capitol in order to prevent legislation they did not like from being voted on by duly elected representatives of the people, that was a disruption of democracy. One could argue all that, but in vanity, because all those things were on the right side of the culture, which is to say on the left wing of it. When Charles Schumer yelled at a rally, quote, "We're coming for you, Gorsuch. We're coming for you, Kavanaugh. You will weep the whirlwind," close quote. That was certainly no incitement, threat, or effort to intimidate our federal judiciary or stop democracy, any more than riots and fire bombings of a federal courthouse in Oregon was. But for several hours, not more, it is true, on January 6th, Congress's actions were delayed for several hours. And by 5 p.m. Phoenix time on that same January 6th, Congress was back in session validating votes. 5 p.m. Phoenix time that very day. Back to Orwell, as he put it. Our language becomes ugly and inaccurate because our thoughts are foolish, he writes, but the slovenliness of our language makes it easier for us to have foolish thoughts, as he points out. Which gets us to what the Supreme Court is hearing today, a case on abortion and viability of life that will or could or might amend a nearly 50-year-old case dealing with the life of the unborn and the rights of the mother carrying that unborn. To many, any change to this decision, Roe v. Wade, per Chuck Schumer, should release a whirlwind. U.S. Senator Jeanne Shaheen of New Hampshire stated Monday, quote, "I think if you want to see a revolution, go ahead. Outlaw Roe v. Wade and see what the response is of the public, particularly young people," close quote. There it is, in normal language. The Supreme Court must decide a certain way or prepare for justified revolution. But Donald Trump was a threat to democratic processes, of course, don't you know? May I say a few things to update where we are on this in light of George Orwell's language concerns? Some say I don't speak about the abortion issue enough. I remember being at a conference once where Harry Jaffa, perhaps the greatest living scholar then on Abraham Lincoln and the Declaration of Independence, gave a talk on liberty, life, and the pursuit of happiness. A questioner in the audience stood up and said, "I've followed your work for years. My question is, are you pro-life? I've not heard you on that." He answered, "Of course I'm pro-life. How could I be anything else? If you followed me for years on Lincoln and the notion that all men were created equal, you would have to know that as much as you would have to be that." But of course, I do understand we live in an age where we cannot presume too much knowledge. I would like to assimilate Harry Jaffa's answer as my own, but perhaps it's not quite sufficient, so let me try to get us there. First, as you know, a pet peeve of mine is a political, journalistic, and commentary trick and class that likes to say the Republican Party should get off these kinds of issues. They like Reagan, they like Goldwater, and they never fussed the Reagans and Goldwaters with stuff like this. That was always wrong, and never more wrong than now. Do they forget, if they ever knew, that Reagan gave speech after speech, not to mention radio broadcast after radio broadcast on the right to life? Do they know he actually wrote a book as president, when he was president, on that issue alone, being the only president in office to write a book while in office? The title of that book, Abortion and the Conscience of a Nation. Let me read to you from its peroration. Quote, "We can echo the always practical woman of faith, Mother Teresa, when she says, 'If you don't want the little child, that unborn child, give him to me.' We have so many families in America seeking to adopt children that the slogan, 'Every child a wanted child,' is now the emptiest of all reasons to tolerate abortion. We will never recognize the true value of our own lives until we affirm the value in the life of others," Ronald Reagan continued. "However low it flickers or fiercely burns, it is still a divine flame which no man dare presume to put out, be his motives ever so humane and enlightened," Reagan wrote. Abraham Lincoln recognized that we could not survive as a free land when some men could decide that others were not fit to be free and therefore should be slaves. Likewise, we cannot survive as a free nation when some men decide that others are not fit to live and should be abandoned to abortion or infanticide. Ronald Reagan said, quote, "My administration is dedicated to the preservation of America as a free land, and there is no cause more important for preserving that freedom than affirming the transcendent right to life of all human beings, the right without no other rights have any meaning." That was Ronald Reagan. I read that late in my life, but something I read a little earlier was this, if I may quote, and it's not Ronald Reagan. Bear with. "There are those who argue that the right to privacy is of a higher order than the right to life. I do not share that view. I believe that life is not private, but rather is public and universal. If one accepts the position that life is private, and therefore you have the right to do with it as you please, one must also accept the conclusion of that logic. That was the premise of slavery. You could not protest the existence or treatment of slaves on the plantation because that was private and therefore outside your right to be concerned. Another area, still quoting, that concerns me greatly is with regard to race, the psycholinguistics involved in the whole issue of abortion. If something can be dehumanized enough through the rhetoric used to describe it, then the major battle has been won. Whites dehumanized blacks by calling them the N-word. It was part of the dehumanizing process. The first step was to distort the image of the human being in order to justify that which they wanted to do and not even feel like they had done anything wrong. Those advocates of taking life prior to birth do not call it killing or murder. They call it abortion. And they further never talk about aborting a baby because that would be too human. Rather, they talk about a fetus. Fetus sounds less human, and therefore the practice can be justified, the speaker says. Continuing, quoting, in conclusion, even if one does take life by aborting the baby, I must also inform and or remind you that there is a doctrine of forgiveness. The God I serve is a forgiving God. The men who killed President John Kennedy and Dr. Martin Luther King may someday be forgiven. Everyone can come to the mercy seat and find forgiveness and acceptance. But, and this may be the essence of my argument, this speaker says, suppose one is so hard-hearted and so indifferent to life until he assumes that there is nothing for which to be forgiven. What happens to the mind of a person and the moral fabric of a nation that accepts the aborting of the life of a baby without a single pang of conscience? What kind of person and what kind of a society will we have years hence if life can be taken so casually? It is that question, the speaker says, the question of our attitude, our value system, and our mindset with regard to the nature and worth of life itself, that is the central question confronting mankind. Failure to answer that question affirmatively will leave us with a hell right here on earth, close quote. A hell right here on earth. That was not Ronald Reagan. That was Jesse Jackson. It was 1977. He's changed his views. Ronald Reagan never did. But those views of a peace were right then and there, true then and true now. This would, of course, be why two other ministers active with Martin Luther King, his best friend, Reverend Ralph Abernathy, and former football player and now Minister Rosie Greer, also endorsed Reagan for president on this very issue. We can debate it, or we can take it all very seriously. In the end, I stand with nobody more than I stand with Abraham Lincoln, who said this: we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This was their majestic interpretation of the economy of the universe. This was their lofty and wise and noble understanding of the justice of the Creator to his creatures. Yes, gentlemen, Lincoln continued, to all his creatures, to the whole great family of man. For in their enlightened belief, nothing stamped with the divine image and likeness was sent into the world to be trodden on and degraded and imbruted by its fellows. They grasped not only the whole race of man then living, but they reached forward and seized upon the farthest posterity. They erected a beacon to guide their children and their children's children and the countless myriads who should inhabit the earth in other ages. Wise statesmen as they were, they knew the tendency of prosperity to breed tyrants, and they established thus the great self-evident truths that when in the distant future some man, some faction, some interest should set up the doctrine that none but rich men or none but white men were entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, their posterity might look up again to that old Declaration of Independence and take courage to renew the battle which their fathers began, so that truth and justice and mercy and all the humane and Christian virtues might not be extinguished from the land, so that no man would hereafter dare to limit and circumscribe the great principle on which the Temple of Liberty was being built.